Good afternoon. How's everyone doing today? Good. Glad to be here. Glad I made it off that flight. So, yes, there's a lot happening, a lot of new things happening, and with that in mind, I sort of felt that I would go a different direction with this presentation today and show some things that I haven't shown in a while, and to let you in a little bit on my intellectual practice of looking at my work and reestablishing and reconfiguring what work I made 20 years ago means today, what work I'm making now means. So it's an exploration, an aesthetic exploration, and a studio-based exploration. So I like to keep things intimate. I'm going to start actually with a clip from my performance ensemble called Moon Medicine. And it is a group of 5 individuals, including myself, on keyboards, doing music direction and artistic direction, video direction. My bassist is the legendary Andre Simone from Prince's original group from Minneapolis, early 1980s, late 1970s. My guitar player is Martin Luther, who was recently in a Julie Taymor film, Across the Universe, and part of the Roots Collective. Jahi Sundance, famous DJ from Robert Glasper and Michelle Indeglio-Cello's band. Swiss Chris, the drummer, former music director for John Legend. And Mark Hines, who is basically the AV computer tech mastermind who helps us with all of our video and sometimes pinches in on bass when necessary. So I'll just start with a little bit of that. Can you have the volume up, please?
Dance, sucker. Keep me on the equinox, but we didn't. So much blue, so much beauty, so much used and misused and abused. So we dance. You the type to make slaves, we the type to free them. We dance. Changing faces every night, we call them how we see them. So we dance. Dance, sucker. On the equinox, yes, we dance. You ain't never had to suffer. You ain't felt that strain. Daddy bought your life and came with your last name. Yet you partying and drinking, trying to kill the pain. So you dance, sucker. Living, yes, we dance. Some dance for chicken. Dance, bitches. Oh, dance. And quit expecting me to jump every time your fingers snap. What's elevated to your ranks is really just a trap. Nah, baby, we ain't had to go to school to learn that. So we bought into the pipe dream, now we want our money back. So we dance. So and dance, sucker.
That performance was at Lincoln Center. Thank you. That performance was at Lincoln Center a few years ago, and I want to give props to Pierre Benu for the video. And that original composition is made by a fantastic female vocalist that I've worked with for many years named Imani Uzuri. It was a remix of her song. We actually wanted her on the gig, but she sort of flaked at the last minute, so we improv through the whole thing. But you know, that's how art happens. So I wanted to show a few objects that I rarely bring out the archives, and I'm going to start with this right here. And this is from an intervention that I did at the Princeton University Museum around a little over a decade ago. And my intervention is actually the small pick right here. Oops, my laser is dead. Okay, the small one on the little white pedestal. And what you're looking at is an intervention in the pre-Columbian section of the museum. And a little bit about the show, it was an invitation for 4 artists to come in and find sections of the museum that they want to riff off of, basically. So I chose the pre-Columbian, Greco-Roman, African, and Renaissance section. And in this particular piece right here, I did my version of an Olmec Afro pick. And the Olmec society and culture, many of you probably know, but some of you may not know, has been under a lot of arguing under the historical and academic umbrella of whether or not these were descendants of Africans. Many say they might be descendants of Inuit people who crossed over from the Bering Strait. Others think that it might be African groups that came over who caught up in westerly bleeding winds from the west coast of Africa. Either way, in the area of Olmec, Old Olmeca, which is north of South America, northeast, there are these huge monolithic busts that have these huge afros, broad noses and lips. And part of my education growing up in Los Angeles was going to a prep school, which is now called Harvard Westlake, which is very posh, Ivy League, blah, 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 blah. But then also getting a real education when I came back home from my parents, my older brother and sister who had me reading about Malcolm X and Sojourner Truth to round off my education. And the Olmec had always come up, and I was particularly interested in them from a book by Ivan Van Sertima called They Came Before Columbus. So this dagger is part of that culture, and that's from around 6 BC. So I figure if they had afros and that dagger, they clearly had an afro pick somewhere in the stash, so I made one. Around that same time, I did this piece called The Hangman's House, which is a book that really, the content of the book was less important, but it was more about the cover and the name of Hangman's House, and me considering America to be the home of so many lynchings that it in fact was the Hangman's House. So what I did was embedded with all these nails and shards of glass, very much in the tradition of an nkisi or a minkisi, which are African objects that are also embedded with nails and sharp objects. The idea being that the accumulation of all those objects and those shards and nails and so on show the power of that group. Not only that, it also wards off evildoers and enemies from that particular area because they are intimidated by it. The way I displayed it was with this mirrored platform, so you can look underneath the book and see the nails actually protruding. It's a very violent piece, and you'll see violence comes along in my work in many different ways. And as a partner piece to this, I did this, what I call Duchamp in the Congo. So this work is literally from 1997, 1998 around, and I was always intrigued by the notion that the modernists were influenced by African societies. So I started to think about the postmodernists and who were they influenced by? And then what would happen if they actually got a chance to set foot in Africa? What kind of collaborations would happen? And this piece, as well as the book, I later used in a performance, which I recently reprised in Philadelphia, where while living in Chicago when I made these, I went out to the suburb at around 6 in the morning. I sat at the local diner. I read my book along with all of the other commuters who were reading their newspapers and their novels. And they were carrying their briefcases, and I was carrying this by the wheel. And I was wearing a suit and tie, and I got on the commuter train with them and walked my way through, and everyone's looking at me like, who the hell is this man, and what is going on? And it was so crowded that I only found one seat left. And when I sat in that seat, this is true, there was an older white woman there, and she just casually glanced and just tipped her glasses down. She's like, oh, that looks like an Nkisi. And I was like, turns out that she was a docent at one of the museums, worked in the African section, knew the whole story. So we had a very enlightened conversation about it. But it just goes to show you, and I often think, while making this work, it serves many purposes for me personally to make the work. It functions in many different ways out in the world, but one of those things is about creating conversation and an entry point to learning more about each other. And that was a perfect example of that happening. But I made several works, and I'm going to go a little out of order here just to show you a glimpse of some of the power objects that I've made, also influenced by works made by indigenous cultures all over the world that are embedded with reverence and power. This particular power object, or fetish object, was at a show at the Sculpture Center a few years ago, and obviously I take a lot of liberties. So instead of it being a small handheld object, this one obviously is larger than life. And being a fetish figure, I thought it would make sense to put it in red vinyl. So now you have a fetish figure. This one is in liquid latex. There's a lotus blossom at the bottom that I made out of skateboard wheels that are dipped in black liquid latex, and a feather boa around the neck. And I was also at the time making these Buddha-like figures. This one is mummified basically in fat shoelaces. And this is a clear cast one that has floating inside of it an indabelly bracelet, a Puerto Rican flag, and a fat gold chain, all of which were made in Taiwan and Mexico. In fact, the Buddha form itself was made in Mexico. And when I was going through a botanica, a shop of religious objects in Harlem, I found these Buddhas that were white opaque Buddhas, but on the bottom they had a clear bottom, and they had a little piece of rice, a 4-leaf clover, what else did they have? Little trinkets from around the world that are supposedly for good fortune, and then it said, Hecho in Mexico. And I thought it was hilarious, the syncretism that was happening in this little tchotchke. So I started to make several works based on them. So here are 4 of them floating, each embedded with different trinkets, and then the central figure has a fat shoelace robe around him. And they're on these display turntables, so they spin around in unison. And that led me to another strain of my work, which are sort of performative objects. And this, I forgot to mention that I lived in Japan for 3 years in the early 90s, and I became very, very sort of involved with learning Japanese and studying everything I could about Buddhism. I, in fact, lived across from a temple, so I would walk through the temple several times a week and just sort of observe and learn more about, the things I was experiencing there. And when I got back to the US, I wanted to make work that was autobiographical, but not necessarily representative of me as, American male. So I started to do these mandala forms, which are actually 12-inch vinyl floor tiles that I would hand cut and make these intricate mandala forms. And then I would take them to breakdancing contests like this one. So I understand on some level you might be wondering right now, what does hip hop and Buddhism and found objects and all these things have to do with each other, if anything? And for me at least, I felt myself that this was autobiographical. In fact, I was at a nexus of these things, these exact combination of elements. But it came from being a child growing up in Los Angeles and exploring all the various hip hop arts DJing, graffiti, emceeing, and breakdancing. And the crew that I had, the Ground Motion Crew of Los Angeles, we would practice 3 or 4 times a week wearing our uniforms, and we would go to the dojo. And we would do our, stretches and our routines, and then we would battle. And it was very much run in our, idealism as a sort of martial arts type of situation, or sort of like a monastery. And I thought that experience was really important when getting to Japan and starting to see these actual rituals taking place in front of me, and trying to see if I had rituals at home that reminded me of that. And so that's where some of these works were born from. Here's another of the dance floors, hand-carved floor tiles. And continuing that, I did other floor-based work. This particular piece is 20 feet by 40 feet, and this is all colored sand. So this was all placed on the ground by hand. I had a team, and we worked for, I would assume, close to 200, 300 hours to lay this thing down. There's no adhesives involved. If you sneeze or run past it, poof, it's gone. So this also came out of, learning about the sand mandalas and the rituals based around creating those. And in fact, at the opening of this, there was probably, several hundred people around the piece itself. And a friend of mine had a 6-year-old daughter who freaked out and ran across the piece in the middle of the show. But I already had pictures, so I was good. But everyone looked, and it was sort of palpable, the fact that everyone thought, oh my God, the work is destroyed. But in fact, the small little footprints and smudges only added to the realism of the work, because up to that point, several people thought it was actually paint. So I considered it a performance. I should probably pay her. Soon after that, still working with, sort of the Buddhist themes and pattern-based work, and that's also another important thing. All those works that I just showed you, all those floor-based pieces, are based off of patterns, which allude to sacred geometry and the sort of power of pattern work, which we'll speak about a little bit later. But I made this glass mandala that I call Lotus, and this is around 7.5 feet diameter. It's a 3/4 inch thick plate disc of glass and a hand-carved design of a lotus blossom, which is a symbol for peace and wholeness, tranquility, and so on. Of course, the lotus comes from the muck and the mire of a pond and then rises to this beautiful blossom. In this case, the closer you get, though, you realize that each of those cross-sections are slave ships. And these are documented manuals of how to pack slave bodies from Africa to the Americas. And to create this, we hand-carved over 6,000 figures, and then later sandblasted it to get the design into the glass. And I was later commissioned by the city of New York to do a much larger version on the side of a high school in the Bronx. This one is made out of steel. It's around 30 feet diameter, weighs around 2 tons. And just a little tidbit, I was cleaning my house the other day, and I found this picture. Can you find me in this? I'll give you a hint, I'm the black guy. So I lived in Japan for, like, as I mentioned, 3 years in the 90s, but then I went back in the early 2000s to do a residency at a small town called Moriya outside of Tokyo. And while I was there, I worked on a project for several months at one of the Buddhist temples where I did seated meditation weekly and then gradually did a bell ceremony. But this was a different day when the head monk invited me to this very rare ceremony that only happens like every 50 or 60 years when they induct a new monk into this society. And the funniest thing is, I'm hanging out with these guys for like 6 or 7 hours. I'm in the back room, I'm taking pictures, I'm the only foreigner on site. And this is a very special event, and it hasn't happened in a long time, and it hasn't happened in so long that none of them know exactly how to do the ritual. So every 30 minutes or so, they take a break, and they're in the back room drinking beer, drinking sake, drinking tea, smoking cigarettes. These are the monks, yes. And they're like, so what do we do now? And that's sort of how I feel with my band backstage. So it's sort of, anyway, I thought I'd show you that. So I'm right there on the far right, standing up right on the far end. I have dreadlocks at the time. So this is a silent piece, and I'll try to go through the rest very quickly because I want to show you some very new stuff. But this just shows another direction of sort of how I work. And this is a found video composition that I did with my friend Jennifer Zakin. And you're looking at old home movies of my family from the West Coast on the right, and her family, a Jewish family from Connecticut and New York on the left. And the piece is called A Small World, and you're seeing, 5th birthdays, Hanukkah, Christmas, Passover, Easter, trips to Disneyland. In fact, my aunt is in the house today, and she might even be in this video, so keep your eyes peeled. So while we were compiling all this video, it became so uncanny, the fact that we were doing these same super mundane American rituals, that at some point in the video we actually switched the screens, and it takes the audience a while to even figure that out. Because, this is basically anybody's home movie at the time. The difference being, of course, there were people who did not have home movies at the time. Other than that, this is middle-class Americana to a T. And I'll just sort of go past that. This is sort of the final clip where she and I are both at a piano. And the full installation has simulated wood panels on the walls, 3-inch shag carpet on the ground, and a love seat so that you can sit there and watch these family movies and sort of reminisce about your own family movies. Coming out of that, this is another power object and a performative object called Blossom. And the soundtrack you hear is what you experience when you walk up to the piece and it starts to play. So it's a player piano that I programmed to play my version of the classic jazz standard, Strange Fruit. These are a few other views, side views of the piece. So this is a fully sculpted tree made out of piping and metal and foam and silk leaves. And as I mentioned, it's a re-engineered piano. So the keys actually move and the pedals move when you experience the piece in person. And around that time, I also started to go into painting, which is interesting because I graduated from the Art Institute of Chicago with a painting degree. And from the moment I stepped foot in the Art Institute to the moment I left, I probably touched paint one time. And it was probably to paint a book. So my return to painting basically was through some research that I was doing about the Underground Railroad. And I came about another contentious historical query was about antique or quilts being used on the Underground Railroad as signposts. So some academics say that there's hidden messages in the quilts, or if they're hung a certain way, that it means that the safe house is open, or to travel a certain amount of miles before making the next turn. It was a map of sorts, a codex. Other academics totally deny this, and every few years there's new evidence proving one point or the other. But either way, as vernacular culture, I found it fascinating, and quilts themselves are vernacular culture and history. So I started to find antique quilts and then began painting and adding my own codex and layer of symbols directly onto them. So you see a bunch of my recurring motifs. In this one you see the smile. I call that a Cheshire grin. And above that piece you see a Cheshire grin, one of the sculptures I've made of the Cheshire grin. And also you see a lotus, that red stamp at the bottom right, that's a lotus. Here's another version where you have a tree, another lotus, and you have this silhouette of this figure on the right, on the lower left side. And that figure is the silhouette of Gordon the slave, this is an iconic image many of you probably know, that shows this slave who tried to escape the South so many times and was whipped, and all this accumulation of scar tissue on him. It was such a fascination that they took pictures. This is now in the Library of Congress. It's an iconic image that I often refer to. There he is again. And so you see how I start to reappropriate my own work into these pieces. And sometimes I take several quilts and fragments of quilts and sew them together to make different shapes and different forms, different heights. And I've even incorporated this to some of my older work, where this one is actually a quilt made of sand. So once again, no adhesives. If you run past it or sneeze, it's gone. Usually with these sand pieces, I usually invite school groups to come in at the end and they get to play in the sand, clean it up, put it into a vessel of some sort, and then later either distribute the vessel into a body of water, which is the Buddhist tradition, or I hold on to it to figure out how to use it in a performance later. And this all brings me to some more recent work, which really started as a reaction to seeing the very public deaths of Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner and Michael Brown and Sandra Bland and Tamir Rice, and I can go on and on and on and on. So I started to create a series called BAM. So for this series of work, going back into the figures and power objects that I've always been interested in, I have been collecting African figures for many years. Some of them are authentic, antiques. Some of them are, have been made like literally weeks or months ago and covered with shoe polish to look like they were made, several decades ago. The authenticity of them was not so important to me, but it was more the icon of them. And then I dipped them in wax to sort of get rid of all their notable features so they all look the same. Then I take them to a shooting range and I sculpt them ballistically using 9mm, 12 gauge shotguns, 45s, a whole basically cache of different guns. And after that I take the remnants and I cast them in bronze. And the bronze picks up every single splinter of wood, drip of wax, and hole that goes through the body. And each of these figures are named after recent victims of police brutality. Now, of course, the question is, we all know that this is not a new phenomenon. And this came very reactionary because of those recent publicized events that I mentioned. And for a while, I was very ambiguous to use the figure because I think the figure is just, it's weighed down by so much history and context that I really had to be in the right headspace to work with it. And as a result of seeing those events, I could not use the figure. And I've been doing these for around 2 years now, I think, 2.5 years, and I have to say, the way I feel about them now has been changing because the first several were, as I mentioned, dedicated to specific events. But now I'm starting to see them collectively as not actually a symbol of death and demise, but more a symbol of resilience. And if we really take seriously this notion of the power object is exactly that. It's supposed to be something that is revered, feared, looked at, but as a constant reminder of the power of a group of people and of the past. And I think America is extremely vulnerable to historical amnesia, racial amnesia. And that is one of the charges of my work. Even when I personally don't want to do some of this work, I have to because I know it lasts a bit longer than me, and if it at least transmits this message to somebody, then at least it's doing something. So my most recent show at Marianne Boesky's gallery that just closed, that Klaus mentioned, I'm just going to run through a few images from there. This is one of the more recent quilts. This piece is called Louie. And this is an overview look of how the gallery was. So there's one of my new quilt pieces on the far left, which is actually a three-dimensional quilt made out of wood and then surfaced with different antique quilts. Louie is right to the right of that. The central figure right there is the central figure of the show called Selah, which of course is sort of a liturgical, musical prayer directive. It's a phrase that appears after a passage that literally means to pause and reflect over what you've just heard or just read. Oh, also that blue quilt in the back is dedicated to Paul Mooney, the comedian. I'm sure some of you know who he is. If not, Google. And then back there is a recent series of works that are made out of sequin and carved figures, and that particular piece is called Overstood, and I'll show you some details of that in a second. On one of the adjacent walls are also other varieties of quilt pieces that I've done. The one on the far left are is a quilt that's cut into 3 pieces. Each piece is then framed and then hung horizontally. And then I turn that into the backdrop of a painting. It's hard for you to tell from this image, but all that black paint is on the glass that is framing the work. So it is not actually on the quilt, it's on the glass and creates layers. And I'll show you how that looks with another piece. This was in the back room. This is the largest of the BAM series so far. This is a 6 feet tall seated warrior queen. She has been shot and damaged, and she's still ready for the fight. And this is a partner piece next to it of the quilt with her silhouette, and then a silhouette of her silhouette on the quilt. And Overstood, this is actually taken from a photograph from a press conference of Black Panthers in 1968 in Oakland, California, as a result of the firing of the 2 men on the left. That is Bobby Seale, who's the 3rd one, going from the left. He's the 3rd one, the one that looks like he's speaking. And basically, you know, it's a Black Panther press conference, so you can imagine some of the things that were being talked about. The 4th figure actually was just somebody in the audience who happened to be right there in the photograph. And I wanted there to be some ambiguity. There is the potential for these to be Black Panthers. There is the potential for them to be a barbershop quartet. You don't quite know. But what you don't see in that picture, you might be able to tell better here, is the scale of this piece. So the topmost figure is around 13 feet tall. So when you stand next to it, you are dwarfed by this thing. And that's why it's called Overstood, because you have to look up to understand how these elders are looking down on you. And these are the figures where the shadow of those elders emanates from. So 4 figures on the ground, and the light shooting and casting their shadow on the wall. And these are just close-ups of the quilt piece, the wooden 3-dimensional quilt. From one side it looks like this, and then the other side it appears like that. And I consider this to be a hyper object, basically an object that is never fixed. The more you walk around it, the more it unfolds and folds on itself. It's actually sort of a strange optical phenomenon, but it's only wood and quilt. So I like to keep the materials extremely minimal, but to try to have the impact to be maximal. This is a smaller version of one of those type of quilts with an anamorphic drawing. So what looks like a 3-dimensional sort of sphere floating, as you get to the side view, that illusion starts to collapse. You can only see it in one spot where it makes that 3-dimensional effect happen. So I don't know how we're doing for time. No cues, okay, I'm just gonna keep going, okay. These are other works on paper that were part of the show. No, not that, this one. And these are textiles that I find. Some of you may recognize the kente cloth on the top part of this piece, and then the cranes and some of the other material come from antique kimonos. And this one is comprised of all kente cloth that's cut and pasted and collaged together, and then the optical geometry is done with gold leaf. And here's a detail of one of the framed quilt pieces where you can see the frame on the side, the glass. Some of the painting is on top of the glass, some of it is inside the glass on top of the quilt itself. So layer after layer of work, of process. And this is the last piece of that show. It's called Infinite Tabernacle. And you see 5 video monitors. Those are all playing, and they're all working in concert with each other. So this is a compilation of around 6 or 7 different BAM figures that I shot at the shooting range. And this shows them either being shot and exploded in slow motion, or sometimes being rebuilt, the video going backwards. So you see the point of impact erasing the destruction. So the limbs fly back into place, the head flies back into place. So it's in this constant flux between life and death. Okay, thank you.